Well, welcome everybody to the Bay Area Council's Bay Area Impact webinar series. We're going to get going in just one moment. Well, good morning, everybody. We're really glad that you could join us for this webinar today. It's part of the Bay Area Council's ongoing Bay Area Impact webinar series on issues of particular importance to the region's economy. We've been focusing in recent weeks on issues related to COVID. We're changing gears now to focus specifically on another very important topic, also long-term in nature of U.S.-China relations. I'm Sean Randolph. I'm Senior Director at the Bay Area Council's Economic Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I want to encourage everyone who would like to submit questions. Please do, though, through the bar at the bottom of your screen using the question and answer feature. So don't use the chat feature. Please use the question and answer feature. And you can start submitting your questions anytime, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So to kick us off, just a word of introduction to the topic. We're at a very challenging moment now in U.S.-China relations. They're probably at their lowest ebb since they've been in 30 years or more, since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. It started really perhaps 3 years ago with the U.S.-China trade war, which is still unresolved, despite a phase 1 trade agreement having been signed last January. But since then, it's been extended to include a widening range of issues, everything from Chinese investment in the United States to Chinese students and scientists studying at U.S. universities, Huawei, technology policy, technology competition, China's treatments of Uyghurs in Western China, China's application of security law in Hong Kong, COVID, and broader geographic concerns. So the list is lengthening. It's of particular relevance to us here in the Bay Area and the Bay Area Council because for more than 12 years, the Council has served as a bridge for Bay Area and California companies wanting to do business in China, and many of them have established themselves there with our assistance. Now that's happening against the backdrop of an increasingly complex political environment. And what we want to discuss today is the current landscape for U.S.-China relations and give our members and our partners a deeper perspective on the political and the economic landscape today, going beyond the rhetoric, as well as looking at what it may look like in the future. And we're really fortunate to have an extraordinary panel of deep experts on China to discuss that with us today. I'll introduce each of them briefly and then invite them to make some initial remarks before we go into some questions. First, Andy Rothman. Andy is an investment strategist with Matthews Asia. He's based here in San Francisco, where he develops research on economic and political developments in China. He has more than 20 years of experience working in and on China, including having served at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, covering macroeconomics and domestic policy in China. Lyric Hughes Hale is the editor-in-chief of Econ View, which is an online news and analysis-based service. Lyric is based out of Chicago. She advises multinational corporations on international business, has been involved in China for very many years, and was the founder of a very groundbreaking online publication called China Online from 1998 to 2003 that had 60 people working here and in China and really pioneered a lot of the journalism around economics in China in an online mode. We also are very privileged to have with us Robert Atkinson. Rob is the founder and the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is considered by many to be the leading think tank in the United States on science and technology policy. Rob testifies frequently before Congress. He writes on these topics a lot, globally as well as on China. And among other books, he is the author of one called Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage, which is very pertinent to our discussion today. These are all deep experts on China. They're going to share some perspective with you at a high level about the status of the relationship and where it's going. And then we'd love to get your questions and their comments. So let's open it up. And maybe if we can start with you, Andy. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of media buzz. Are we in a new Cold War? You've been in China, you've been in Beijing, and you see it from here now. Give us your perspective on the state of U.S.-China relations, and are we in a new Cold War?
Thanks, Sean. Great to be here with everybody. Yeah, as you noted, I did work in Beijing for a number of years. I had an opportunity to work in Shanghai and Guangzhou and Hong Kong over the last 30 years. Unfortunately, the last time I was in Beijing, though, was back in December. And frankly, I'm not sure when I'm going to get to go back to China. But let me start my remarks with a top-down look at U.S.-China relations. Clearly, there are many troubling aspects of the Chinese government's behavior at home and abroad. In places like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and the East and South China Seas, how do we encourage and incentivize the Chinese government to improve its behavior? To understand whether policies designed to isolate or contain China will work better than policies intended to engage constructively with Beijing, let's take a quick look back at recent history. When Nixon changed the US policy from isolation to engagement, he sought to change China's behavior abroad, not to change its system of governance at home. There were some successes. Engaging with China contributed to the end of the Vietnam War and eventually to the end of the Soviet Union. Jimmy Carter later transferred our diplomatic recognition to Beijing from Taipei with the hope of further incentivizing the Chinese government to behave better abroad. There were some successes here as well. Taiwan, for example, which had been led by an authoritarian one-party regime, held its first direct election for its president in 1996, and now Taiwan is a wealthy, thriving democracy with the rule of law. Now, this is primarily the result of the hard work and sacrifices of the people of Taiwan, but US engagement with Beijing helped create an environment which supported this transformation. Bill Clinton brought China into the WTO with the intent of opening up a market for American exports and to further integrate China into global institutions to incentivize better behavior abroad. There were some successes here again. While China has clearly not lived up to all of its WTO commitments, it has done enough to enable GMs to sell more cars in China than in the US. Prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, Nike enjoyed 22 consecutive quarters of double-digit revenue growth in China. And China is especially important to the US semiconductor industry, and I'm sure Rob will talk more about that. Since China joined the WTO, US exports to that market are up over 500% compared to a 100% increase to the rest of the world. Prior to the current tariff dispute, China was our largest overseas market for agricultural goods, up by 1,000% since they joined the WTO. The structure of the Chinese economy has also changed for the better. When I first worked in China in Guangzhou in 1984, there were no private companies. Everyone worked for the state. You couldn't even find a privately run restaurant. Today, in contrast, almost 90% of urban employment is in small, privately owned entrepreneurial firms. From a strategic perspective, China has helped us pursue our objectives with Iran and North Korea. Now, I share the frustration many of you have over the limitations of engagement in achieving all of our objectives with the Chinese government. But we need to be clear about what has been accomplished, and we need to be realistic about whether alternative policies will achieve more or less. Will a trade war, for example, incentivize the Chinese government to change its behavior? The Chinese economy is no longer export-led. Last year was the 8th consecutive year in which the services and consumption part of the economy was the largest part. Domestic consumption accounted for almost 60% of China's economic growth. Over the last 5 years, on average, net exports, that's the value of a country's exports minus their imports, net exports contributed 0 to China's economic growth. Will unilateral US efforts to contain China succeed? Well, last year, only 17% of China's total exports went to the United States. Last year, more than half of US NATO allies, as well as Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, did more trade with China than with the US. Does the US government want to put these partners in the position of having to choose sides? Is it possible to isolate or decouple from China when last year China accounted for 40% of global economic growth. That's larger than the combined share of global growth from the US, EU, and Japan. Can we address global issues like climate change, drug trafficking, and nuclear proliferation without cooperation from China? In January of this year, President Trump spoke in positive terms about the US relationship with China. He said, it's the best it's ever been. His national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, said the Chinese don't have a democracy. They don't share our values. At the same time, there's a huge opportunity to work with the Chinese. In my view, that opportunity still remains open to us. So let me end with a couple of questions for us to consider. If instead of engaging with the Chinese government, we try to isolate or contain them, will that give us more leverage over them on issues such as their behavior in Xinjiang or Hong Kong? Will that incentivize them to behave better in the East China Sea? Thanks. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Andy. So Lyric, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Andy. That was really, really interesting. Great to hear your what you're thinking nowadays. And Sean, thank you for inviting me to participate. U.S.-China relations were once so full of promise, but they've certainly lost their halo lately. It's hard to imagine how we got here. From Mark Zuckerberg asking Xi Jinping to bestow a Chinese name upon his firstborn child, to his testimony before Congress yesterday, which was a complete volte-face. I'm different than most commentators in that I do not believe that this change emanates from the Trump administration. It's been brewing for a while. In fact, the idea of doing something about China probably has more bipartisan support than any other issue in Washington today. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but you can expect things to get far worse before the election. I think that the shift in the relationship between the world's two largest economies is largely driven by internal forces within China itself, and has been, like many other trends, has been accelerated by COVID-19. There's a lot of talk now about a Cold War, a new Cold War. I first visited the Soviet Union in the 60s and China in 1979, and I've studied the language and history of both countries. We seem to have forgotten the parameters of the first Cold War. At its height, the USSR was 15% of global GDP, compared to 16% for the PRC today. And as Michael Pettis has reminded us, at the time, most Americans feared that the USSR would eclipse the United States economically, not just militarily, within a couple of decades. Russia was in some areas technologically superior to the US, led us in the race for space. Embassies were hotbeds of espionage activities a la James Bond. Russia stealthily moved beyond its geographic boundaries, forming the Soviet bloc. Does that sound familiar? Yes, because it is. We need to remember how it all ended too, with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, who is something of a scary figure to Chinese leaders. Reagan's insight was that Russia was weaker than it seemed, and then he pushed hard. China too is far more vulnerable than it seems. The weaknesses of its healthcare system and food security should now be obvious to the entire world, and this continues. Its demographic challenges are without historical precedent. The pressures of building so much, so fast have come home to roost in the environment. And we now see that the Three Gorges Dam is in danger of failure, possibly affecting millions. We hear, but we don't know much about the internal political divisions, but they seem to be intensifying. China, historically a realm without diplomats, has reverted to imperial hostage-taking and Twitter as its primary means of diplomacy. What does this mean for US companies with operations in China? Not a feature of US-USSR competition. These are dangerous times, but the waters are still navigable and smart choices can be made. It's not time to throw up your hands, but rather to follow Ronald Reagan's lead and compete harder. For example, the China 2035 is a program to position China to dominate global technical standards. US technology companies should not allow the kind of institutional capture that took place with the World Health Organization. Sean asked me to say something about investments. US FDI in China has been increasing, but you need to look under the hood. China has capital controls. And some of the increase is due to an inability to get money out, not new money coming in. In a global recession, however, it's difficult to imagine supply chains really moving out, a highly problematic and expensive process. We need to remember why we established relations with China in the first place, which according to Henry Kissinger, was to block the USSR. It was realpolitik, not idealism. In the meantime, American companies have reaped a huge benefit over the past 40 years. Opening of new markets, offshoring not only of labor, but also adherence to OSHA standards, in exchange for which China ignored IP. We need to look at this honestly and move on to the next stage of a more durable US-China relationship. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lyric. So Rob, you focus on technology, and technology is probably at the heart of some of the current conflicts between the US and China today, and probably at the heart of China's economic strategy for the long term. How do you see the technology landscape today between the US and China?
Sure. So thank you, Sean. Look, if this was really an issue about the Chinese taking our furniture industry, which they did in the 2000s, or plastics industry, and nobody, a few people would care, the AFL-CIO might care, but it wouldn't be a national issue. The reason it's a bipartisan national issue is because the Chinese government has set its sights on global dominance, and I use that word specifically, global dominance of a whole set of advanced technology industries that up until now the United States was generally seen as being in the leader of. And that's why this is going on. And if you look at China 2025, you'll see that list. We wrote a report last summer looking at the Chinese policies in biopharmaceuticals. And absolutely, while they're not anywhere near where we are today, you could have said the same thing 20 years ago with regard to telecom equipment. I wrote a big analysis of why we lost Lucent, and it'll be coming out in September. But 20, years ago, we had the top two telecom equipment companies in the world, Nortel and Lucent. Nortel was Canadian, but most of their jobs were in the US. And we don't have either of them now, largely because of China. So it's easy to sort of lose sight and say, well, they can't do it. They're not going to do it in these emerging sectors like aerospace with Comac, semiconductors. I think the Intel announcement last Friday was, if that wasn't the wake-up call, which it wasn't, it really tells you a lot about this country when Intel said it was way behind where it expected to be on going to 7 nanometer and was thinking about or going to go more with fabless. So I think there's kind of three big things in how do we think about this. There's sort of, how is the US responding to inward things from China? And the answer is, we're not gonna, there's just no way that regime is ever gonna go back to what it was. We did CFIUS reform. They're even, as we know, talking now about reversing the TikTok acquisition of ByteDance or whatever it was called. There's an increasing pressure now with students coming into this country, Chinese students, where, you know, a not insignificant number of them, I'm not saying it's a big number, but 10, 15% are closely aligned with the Communist Party, and many of them have assignments to collect IP. That issue is not going to go away. The phase 1 tariffs, which people sort of seem to have forgotten, those tariffs are still in place, and they're in place for a reason, which is the administration's policy is to get gradual decoupling out of China from American companies, and it's working. If you look at the latest import numbers from China, in these product areas, they're down significantly, and at the same time, imports from Vietnam and Mexico in the same product categories are up significantly. So at the margin, US companies are having less in China and more in Southeast Asia and Mexico, and to some extent back here. And lastly, I think this pressure is only going to grow for American companies to not be in China. It's not going to be, you know, like the Soviet Union where you can't do anything, but it's not going to be as easy as it used to be. If you're going to have a lot of production in China, you're going to come under much more public and congressional scrutiny. On the export side, obviously we have the export controls, the new increases that the Commerce Department just came out with on chips as a way to cripple Huawei. And then I think I've heard, although I don't know, we don't know for sure, but I've heard that next month, which coming up shortly, that the Bureau of Industry and Industry Security in Commerce is coming out with their list of emerging and foundational technologies that are potentially subject to export controls. I don't know what that list is going to look like. I'm hoping that it's quite limited, but it may not be, and there may be challenges there. On the domestic side, I think one of the things that the China challenge has spurred, and I want to say what took them so long, because we've been arguing for this for over a decade, but we're finally beginning to have a serious conversation in Washington about the need for a national advanced industrial strategy. We saw that recently with these two semiconductor bills that were merged together from Senator Cotton and Cornyn, where they went both through the NDAA in the House and the Senate. If they get through appropriations, that's a significant chunk of money. We're talking 30, $40 billion to support advanced R&D, as well as incentives to reshore fabs to this country. That is a big deal. The last time we did anything like that was 89 or 88 with Sematech. At the same time, you've got a bill from Chuck Schumer and a Republican, Todd Young from Indiana, called the Endless Frontier Act. $100 billion over 10 years, targeted to 10 technologies that are critical to our future. I think that that's just the beginning of that. We're going to have more efforts like that. The Biden campaign has put out a whole agenda on what they want to do. I think one of the most important things that Silicon Valley can do, by far, if you want to avoid a heightened trade war, you need to get behind these policies. You can't sit on the side, as I'm going to be blunt and say too many people in Silicon Valley do, sit on the side and say, oh, Washington, and who cares? If you don't come and back these kinds of proposals, there's going to be a lot more political pressure to do an offensive strategy rather than a defensive strategy, meaning to build up what we have. I'll let just a couple minutes, lastly, just to talk about where I think we're going. I probably disagree a little bit with maybe the other speakers. I actually think we are in for a new Cold War. I don't think it's not going to be like the old Cold War where we sold them Pepsi and wheat. We're much more integrated. That's not going back. But we are, I believe, in a new Cold War that's going to last 30 years. There's a great article by my colleague and co-author Mike Lind in National Review. I wrote another piece in there called Who Lost China? I just don't think these tensions are going to go away. The Chinese, with their wolf diplomacy, they show no signs of having any interest in behaving normally. They continue to show signs of economic aggression. They haven't toned down their intellectual property theft. So I just don't think that's going to go away. And lastly on that is two things. You see now, historically, the Republican Party was a party that was much more kind of free trade and globalist, even in the face of these problems with China. That is fundamentally changing. And I don't know how many people understand how real and important that is. You've got an entire wing of the Republican Party now, a lot of younger younger senators who are the future of the party, frankly, people like Marco Rubio from Florida, Tom Cotton, Hawley from Missouri, who don't talk about free trade as much as they talk about national greatness and pushing back against China. And I'm not saying they're protectionists, but it's a very different wing of the party now, and I think that wing is ascendant. And lastly, we have increasingly frustrated allies. The Brits are really frustrated. The Australians are frustrated. Even the Germans, they would be the last people you'd think would get frustrated. Even the Germans are getting frustrated. And I think if a Biden administration, if Trump is elected, we'll probably continue to see more unilateralism. Although there's some multilateralism in the Trump approach. But I think if Biden gets elected, they'll double down on multilateralism and really trying to work with our allies to contain China and to put pressure on them. So I just don't think that's going to go away. And I think companies have will have a hard time navigating all of that. It's not like it's going to be, we're not going back to pre-16.
Thanks, Rob. A follow-up on that, if you go back 15, 20 years or more, conversations about having a quote industrial policy in the US have kind of gone nowhere. There's been a lot of philosophical resistance to it. So it sounds like you're saying that that environment has changed, that there's a more bipartisan appetite for technology policy, industrial policy, whatever we want to call that, coming out of Washington. I know that the administration has wanted to reduce funding in science and technology research. One might argue that we should have more of that, if anything, and that's how we really compete. But do you sense any kind of change or see changing the environment for those kinds of policies domestically?
I do, absolutely. You know, the Trump administration has been aggressive on China, but they have not been aggressive on a domestic technology strategy, particularly one, as you noted, Sean, with regard to funding. The United States government now spends less on R&D as a share of our economy than we did before Sputnik. I mean, it's pitiful. We're 23rd in the OECD on funding university research. So there's a big hole to fill, if you will. Now, again, if you look at some of these bills, the idea that we would have a $30 or $40 billion package, including cash grants to one industry, that never would have happened even 3 years ago, 2 years ago. You know, that is a sea change. Now, again, the bill hasn't passed, although it went through I think it's doing well in the authorization process, so the money is where it matters. But still, the fact that you can have a lot of Republicans as well as Democrats get, you know, well behind that. The fact that if you look at Biden's proposal, 600, I think it is, I might be wrong on the number, $600 billion investment plan for the United States, a lot of that in R&D, not all of it. I do think that things are going to change.
Interesting. Okay, important time for sure. Maybe two questions before we go to the audience here. One is supply chain. So a lot of our companies are involved in global supply chains. A lot of that threads into China. There's a lot of discussion about the unthreading of U.S. supply chains to China, and I think that's getting a lot of implicit or explicit encouragement from Washington. But it's really hard to do it. Their production capacity is massive, and it's expensive, you know, in this climate, as we were just hearing. So maybe for anybody on the panel, how far do you think it's likely that supply chains, especially around technology between the U.S. and China, will unthread? And do you think that's likely to be more in some industries than others, assuming that a complete unthreading simply isn't going to happen? Andy?
Thanks, Sean. It is a complicated question. There's a few elements of this that we can start with. One is it's really important to recognize that the overwhelming majority of foreign investment in China, including by American companies, is designed to produce goods to sell to Chinese people. And this is the fastest growing market, by some metrics, the largest market in the world. So these companies are not going to be leaving China because they're selling to China. The other part of it is China has invested in education, in infrastructure, and in R&D, in research and development. The kinds of things that Rob noted we haven't done a very good job of here at home. And as a result, it's a great environment for supply chains in value-added industries. So yes, we have seen over the last decade some shift of low value-added, labor-intensive manufacturing, shoes and toys and textiles, away from China to places like Vietnam and Malaysia and Bangladesh for economic reasons. But for the more sophisticated supply chains, there's just not a lot of options there, at least not options that are economically feasible for other countries. And then finally, as I noted in my opening remarks, China's the driver of global growth. The idea that we can build a wall between us and the Chinese economy just doesn't make a lot of economic or political sense, especially since few, if any, of our partners and allies are going to go along with that. Thanks.
Anybody else have thoughts on that?
I'd really like to agree with Andy with everything he said. I think that's exactly right. And as I said, we're in a recession now. It's very expensive to build new supply chains. But I do think companies it won't be just in time, kind of delivery systems that people are thinking about. They'll be thinking about redundancy. So I don't think they'll be replaced, but there will be redundant supply chains for everybody that get developed over the next 10 years.
Oh, I think it's, again, if you're listening to the Washington conversation, there's an enormous interest in bringing back certain things in the supply chain. If you saw President Trump's announcement yesterday, or no, Tuesday, about a very large loan to Kodak to produce APIs, drug ingredients here, that's directly related to China. You're seeing legislation that's talking about moving much more drug production out of China to here, medical supplies, things like that. We're going to see that in a very big way in semiconductors, where you've got very serious concerns from DoD about being as reliant as they are. The other thing that's certainly possible is to some kind of copying of what Prime Minister Abe has done. He had announced recently this big grant program for companies to move out of China, and it was a bunch of money. And they just announced, I think last week, the results, and it was pretty significant. There were a number of companies, Japanese companies, that moved back to Japan or moved to some other place like Indonesia, third market. There's certainly talk about doing something like that in the U.S. I would agree with Andy on one important point, that the more we sell to China, whether it's from an export perspective or being in China, that is totally in our interest. And yet when you hear the discussions in Washington, it's oftentimes this blanket China bad, don't do anything. And I always explain to people here that every dollar that we sell to China, whether it's an export or when we're in China, is a dollar less that a Chinese firm has. We're contending for these dollars, for this market share. And I just would warn the listeners that that distinction isn't really well understood among many people in Washington. It's just oftentimes a blanket, let's do nothing with China. The idea that Google might want to go back into China, which I think is 100%, absolutely, go back into China if you think it's in your business interest. Let's take market share away from Baidu. That's seen in Washington as being almost traitorous. And I think that's a huge mistake that if we go down that path, that we're going to suffer severely from.
Can I follow up on that, Sean, for a second?
Of course.
Another element to that I think is really important, and I'd love to hear your views on this, Rob, on the technology side. If you look at our semiconductor industry, Intel, I think it's about a quarter of their global revenue from China. Texas Instruments, it's over 40%. I believe Qualcomm, it's maybe 2/3 of their global revenue. If we lose that business for any variety of political reasons, what happens to the balance sheets of our most prominent tech companies? What happens to their budget for R&D? And are we shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of innovation by saying to companies in China, stop buying American technology, develop your own? Or I'd love to hear what you think about that, Rob.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting when I think you had mentioned Tiananmen, Andy, and one of the interesting things, we wrote a study of telecom equipment, the evolution of it, and Huawei. It's on our website. And one of the things that really drove the Chinese to develop the domestic telecom equipment sector that they had was when, after Tiananmen, we banned telecom equipment exports to China. And that woke them up, it scared them. They put an enormous amount of money, mostly through the PLA, into their labs to develop telecom equipment, and it really gave them a big head start. We're doing the same thing today. I mean, we have two big problems with that. Number one, we're giving them a huge motivation, even more than they already have, to develop alternatives to US semiconductors. And secondly, we're taking away all that, why would we take away that market share? When in reality, they're still going to be able to buy that. They'll buy it from the Japanese or the Taiwanese or the South Koreans or the Germans or whatever. And yet, when you talk to administration officials, they have this view, which I just really disagree with. And their view is, well, we're going to lose it anyway, eventually. So it doesn't matter whether we lose it now or in 10 or 15 years. I don't think that's definitely set in stone. And number one, I'd rather have 15 more years of revenue than not. So again, I think that's a really, really good point. We don't want to cut our nose off to spite our face here.
So another question before we move on, and I think we're starting to overlap these questions with those from our other participants, is that when a lot of this really got momentum early in the Trump administration, it was and has been the US out there alone, like wielding a really, really big stick, but mostly tariffs. But it seems now in the last few months that other allies and countries are sort of coming around, perhaps. You've seen Australia taking a increasingly hard line with China. You see the European Union starting to talk about the need for reciprocity in terms of access for Chinese investment into Europe versus their investment into China. The UK has kind of turned a corner saying, no, Huawei's not going to come in. I think, as you mentioned, Rob, Japan is incentivizing some companies to take investment out of China. And even the Southeast Asians and ASEAN, who haven't shown much backbone on the South China Sea, seem to be getting some. So it feels like there is some movement toward a pushback on China among a lot of our partners. This isn't even to mention India, that just banned, I think, 49 or 59 Chinese apps, which opens the door for a lot of our companies in India now. So we haven't done a very good job trying to coordinate with allies and friends to kind of have a common conversation and push back on where we think China is going the wrong way. I was wondering, what does anybody feel about whether that's something that is or isn't happening? And do you think that this administration, or I'm going to assume it would happen more in a Biden administration, would actually be able to have a more kind of unified process with our allies to kind of engage China in a not a confrontational way, but this is the way we think you need to behave? That's an open question to anybody.
I'd like to jump in on Australia, because watch Australia and what's happening there now. And, you know, there are very few person-to-person, government-to-government meetings going on now, but the Australian foreign minister and Mike Pompeo met over the last couple of days, and the thought is that they've been discussing this cooperation and how Australia, which had looked to China for all of its growth, is now reconsidering and thinking what is plan B for their country if China turns out to be problematic in terms of investment, in terms of the number of students they have there. I think that the relationship, what's been going on with China, has created a stronger relationship over the last 6 months between Australia and China, and a significant change in public opinion in Australia.
Thanks. Also, we're getting into some of the questions now. How would policy be different toward China, does anybody think, under a Biden administration? And from the Chinese side, a lot of this seems to be really driven by President Xi, but there is some debate at some level within China's leadership, within the Communist Party, about the correct, the best path. So does anybody see any prospect for change in China? Whether, even if it's a practical, we need to change course, this isn't working so well, to be more engaging with us on our issues, or are they locked into a pattern and we shouldn't expect that to change? And then would there be a different approach to China under Biden? That's a question for anybody.
Okay, I'll take that. I've read 2 documents published by the Biden campaign. One was titled something like Rebuilding the American Economy. And it was interesting that China wasn't mentioned very often. And when it was usually mentioned in the context of how China is doing the kinds of things that we've been talking about, and America isn't, investing a lot in R&D and STEM education. And the focus to me seemed to like we saw in the United States to Sputnik, where we poured much more money into R&D, into STEM education, and in fact really jump-started the semiconductor industry with government support here. And then on the foreign policy side, what little that they've published so far seemed to talk a lot about working closely with American allies and partners on a more collaborative approach. And so both of those things leave me optimistic that there is a possibility for a better direction. But I also think that back to a more constructive relationship, because you only have to go back, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, to January, when the president and his national security advisor were talking in much more constructive and optimistic terms about the room for collaboration and partnership between the United States and China. And maybe after the election, if Trump gets a second term, we could see them move back in that direction as well. Thanks.
Oh, I just could add to that, John. I encourage people to read the very good article earlier this year by Jennifer Harris, who's now out in the Bay Area, and Jake Sullivan, who was, they were both top officials in the Obama administration in foreign policy. And particularly Jake was much more of a kind of globalist, if you will, global liberalist, free trader. When they were in the Obama administration. This new piece is very telling because it is really a sharp departure. They basically acknowledge that while maybe they were right then, China has shifted so much that it requires a new approach. They use the term very explicitly, great power confrontation. That term really wasn't used in the Obama administration. That term is not going to go away. That's what's going on, is great power confrontation. So at one level, I think Biden there are certainly people in the Democratic establishment who are waiting to get into a Biden administration to try to bring things back to 2016 or 2015. I don't want to deny that. I don't think they'll be successful. I think it's that the ship has turned the corner, if you will. And so I think the Biden team will be more aggressive on China, significantly more aggressive than an Obama administration was, just because the times have changed, the politics have changed. But at the same time, they will be much more focused on building relationships with allies. You know, when the president said that Europe's trade deficit and Europe is a bigger economic threat than than China was, that was not helpful because it just alienated the Europeans. And we can't afford to alienate the Europeans in this space or our other allies around the world. The last point I'll just say on that, I don't think we should be Pollyannish about that. A lot of our allies have no backbone. They don't have as much integrity as they should, in my view. The Germans want it both ways. The Germans want us to protect them, and they also want to sell as much to China, and they want us to get out in front on the battlefield, not militarily, but the economic battlefield in front of China. The Brits are more, I think, closer to us. The Australians are closer to us. Even the Japanese are closer to us there. But so I think Europe really fundamentally is the big unknown here. You know, is Europe going to want it both ways, which is what they've always done, or are they going to have to take what they've always done since the Cold War ended, or are they going to have to take sides? I would guess they're not going to take sides. I think they're going to try to have it both ways.
Yeah, interesting.
I think that you're exactly right about Germany, for example. I think that there's not, the Chinese might be dreaming that there'll be a change if Biden is president, but I don't think there is going to be a major change in US-China relations after that point. And going back to my thesis, that I think a lot of what's happening is driven by China itself. And then Sean, going to your question, is that going to change? Is China going to change? And I think we don't know that. And it depends what happens with COVID, what happens with the various issues that are going on right now today in China, you know, including a potential disaster in the Three Gorges Dam that could lead to a national emergency that could have political consequences, as it did in 1931 when the floods gave the communists a leg up on the nationalists. So I think that there's not going to be a big change there. All of the China analysts I know have shifted. Look at someone like Susan Shirk and what she says, very thoughtful commentator. She's changed her position. I think that's permanent.
Thanks. We have a question from Julie Meyer-Wright, who I worked for at one time when she was secretary of the California Trade and Commerce Agency. And she was asking about universities. So Chinese students account for, you know, certainly the graduate level, the largest group of foreign students at our universities here in California and across the country. And of course, a lot of those over the years have stayed and really taken leadership positions in the technology community in Silicon Valley, founded leading companies, and really been threaded deeply into our economy in a productive way. But we're seeing more examples called out by the US government and the media of espionage by students here from China. So university, want to maintain an open academic environment, and they certainly benefit from the revenue from foreign students from China, but they benefit enormously by the contributions that they make. On the other hand, there is this issue that's been raised by the FBI and other agencies across the government about actual or potential espionage, directly or indirectly, by Chinese studying here. So any thoughts on how do we keep that open environment for academic research and keep it internationally open to partners from China, but also address whatever security issues we need to be addressing in light of some of the more recent incidents or cases that have been reported in the media?
Sure, I'll start with that one. This is a really important question. And I don't think anybody on our panel or in our audience would disagree that if there are cases with sound evidence of espionage or theft of intellectual property, they need to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But I'm quite concerned that there has been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of cases that have not been upheld in the courts due to lack of evidence that represent just a challenge to the idea of Chinese students and business people being here, or of Americans of Chinese descent operating in our economy and our universities. And I don't think there's the evidence to support the idea that there's this massive espionage case. The idea that there's a serious share of Chinese students coming here who are spies just because they or their family might be members of the Communist Party just doesn't hold up to scrutiny, I think. And I worry about possibly unintended consequences of racial discrimination that we've seen reported by Chinese Americans so far. And I think everybody needs to be really careful about the language that they use. And on the academic and innovation side, it will be just a tragic loss for not only the R&D budgets for our tech companies that we talked about before, the budgets for our universities, but also our innovation as a society has always depended on immigrants. And to challenge the right of Chinese students to participate in this because of a political fight between two governments, I think would just be a disaster for our economy. Thanks.
I think you're going to see a restructuring of the entire university system in the United States. The economic model was dependent on foreign students who now cannot come here, was dependent on students being in class in person, which is now not happening for probably most of next year. So I think the bigger issue about universities as centers of research and learning is that there will be a sea change in how they operate and how they're funded. And so many were, and not just universities, but also private schools throughout the country, were dependent on Chinese students and Asian students paying full freight, which is not now happening. So I think we're going to see, it's going to be more than espionage. There's going to be a much bigger, that's an issue, but the much bigger issue is how will the American university system survive all of this?
So if I could just, I generally agree with all that. I really don't think, Andy, this is about racism at all. There are people, they're doing it because of the race. Nothing to do with race. We're happy to let Taiwanese students in here. They're Chinese. So I can understand where this could lead to racism, and I think that would be a huge mistake. But the motivation is not racism. The motivation is a concern about intellectual property theft or spying and the like. And it's clearly a small number of people. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but it's not zero. You mentioned that we should have the punishment of the full extent of the law. I agree with that. But if you look at the cases that have been successfully prosecuted over the years of Chinese spies, the punishment is pretty lax. I mean, it's a couple of years in jail, maybe. Nowhere near what it should be for stealing some incredibly important secrets for our military and our economy. So number one, I think we need to have a new law around foreign espionage, economic espionage. Number two, I think universities have to do a better job. They have to be able to demonstrate in a very clear way to, I don't know, Homeland Security or DOJ or whoever, the FBI, that they have in place a serious system that, you know, limits the risk. Now, obviously, the risk isn't ever going to go to zero, but you have to be able to limit the risk. There's a great book by a New York Times reporter called Spy University, and it's pretty shocking what some of these Chinese students have done. And I think the last point is sort of what Lyric was saying. The reason why so many universities do this is because they make money. And, you know, there's so many kids in the United States, working class kids, who are pretty good. I take the state of Maryland, for example, which has a top-notch computer science program. If you're a pretty good kid in Maryland, the odds of you getting into that program are very, very low. You know, you can have a 4 or 5 on the computer science AP test and still not get into University of Maryland. Why is that? It's because they have a number of limited slots only for in-state students, because they can't afford to not have out-of-state and out-of-country students. So I know one of the things that we're going to propose this fall is a new program where kids that are majoring in STEM fields, if you're a middle class or working class kid, in other words, if you're not wealthy, that there would be a voucher that would go along with you, that if you went to an in-state school, the school can make full tuition off of you. I think that would really begin to open up a lot more slots for American kids. You know, I'm not at all saying we shouldn't have slots for foreign kids, but right now there's a lot of American kids who want to go to a program like University of Maryland in CS. They can't get in, so they go and do political science or something else. And I think that's a big loss to the US.
I'm sure the universities would love to have that in place. I'm going to read a question from Jeffrey Heller, one of our members, that relates to actually doing business. And here we go. We've been working, by the way, Jeffrey's an architect here, does a lot of work in China. We've been working successfully as architects and urban designers in China for more than 15 years. The business and government relations have always been excellent. In fact, we have just been asked to get back into a huge urban project. While we're well aware of the significant international issues, what is the total disconnect between the ground experience of companies in China and Washington's increasingly hostile stance regarding China? Is there not a more reasonable approach? So I guess the question there, if I rephrase it just a little bit, is we have a lot of companies that have been very successful in China, and you go to what the polls of the US chamber in Shanghai suggest, that most of them, the great majority, are profitable and want to be more profitable. A lot of them are Bay Area companies. So there does seem to be sort of a disconnect at some level between companies that are on the ground and doing well in China, and then another political layer, which doesn't seem to thread very cleanly with some of that business experience. So what kind of environment does anybody think US companies operating in China today are dealing with? Is it being affected? How's it being affected by the current disputes, whether on the Chinese side or the US side? And do you think is there a lack of dialogue, or do you think what's going on at the governmental level on the US side is actually informed by the experience of companies on the ground? So open question for anybody.
Okay, I'll jump in. I'm not aware of any actions or rhetoric that has come from the Chinese government recently in response to the rise in political tensions, which has been harmful to American company operations there. We know that they're capable of doing that kind of thing. For example, when there were disputes between Beijing and Seoul over the installation of THAAD missiles, there were negative implications for important Korean companies. We saw the similar thing with Japan. But at this point, I think the Chinese government is not doing that with American companies, in part because American companies play a big role of employing Chinese workers. But also, I think they're hoping not to escalate the political tensions. One example, according to companies who follow Apple, Apple has just completed a fantastic quarter in China with its iPhone sales there. Thanks.
Yeah, I
One
think it's
quick
pretty
thing.
interesting. Oh, go ahead. Please,
I was
Rob.
going to say, one quick thing is a little bit of a selection bias going on because the companies that didn't have a happy experience aren't alive. Only the ones that survived. I was talking to a CEO of a Silicon Valley company. Can't say who it was. It was a private, sort of off the record conversation in Washington. He said that the Chinese wanted to come over there, help build, put an operation there. They did it, and he said the Chinese like to have this phrase, win-win operation. If something is win-win, and he's joked. He said it means they win twice. And in this case, they won, and the company was really destroyed, and they lost a lot of money, and they left. So I'm not saying that clearly is not the experience of every company. It's the experience of a lot of companies who've gone over there and had their intellectual property taken. Or there's a good study by a colleague of mine who used to be with the Canadian government, and Margaret, I'll see if I can remember her name, but she did a very good study where she looked at a bunch of Canadian mid-sized companies that went to China to document what their experience was. And there was, it wasn't pleasant. There was one company she talked to where they had a joint venture with two other firms where this company had like 37%. So they were assured majority ownership, against the other two Chinese companies. A year later, the other two Chinese companies just merged, took the company over essentially. So I don't know that it's as happy as a lot of people think. It's not to say that there aren't companies over there making a lot of money and doing okay. A lot of it, I think, depends on the sector. If you're in a sector that's not in Beijing's, sites, you're allowed to do okay. If you're in their sites, it's a little bit tougher.
Thanks. Lyric, any thoughts on that?
I think if you want to hear more about the experience of American companies in China, there's the American Chamber of Commerce, for example, in Shanghai and in Beijing, and they run surveys. You can find their websites and you'll see what their members say are the problems they're experiencing. And top among them is usually intellectual property every year. But a certain number are also, there have been surveys, how many are planning on leaving? And there are 15% or so are planning on moving their supply chains out of China. So I agree with Rob. I think it really does vary by sector. And their success, just like anything else, there are success stories and there are also their failures.
Thanks. So we're about to run out of time. There's a lot of questions. We could go on for a couple of more hours, but before we shut down, are there any last remarks that any of you would like to make on anything we've been talking about this morning? If you'd like to draw a bottom line under the conversation.
I'll just go back to my opening comments, which is I think we need to be careful how we engage with China. We can't wish it to go away. We can't wish the Communist Party to go away. So what are going to be the most constructive ways of dealing with them? On the areas where we can collaborate, we need to collaborate. On the areas where we have problems with China's behavior, is that collaboration going to give us more leverage? And let's think about where we would be today with China if we weren't engaging with them constructively on the issues where we can work. Since Rob recommended a book, I'd also love to recommend a book on the same topic. Mara Histenval has a new book out this year, which is quite good, called The Scientist and the Spy, which looks at the espionage question and how the Justice Department is going after them. And then I write regularly on the Chinese economy and US-China relations, and that's available on the Sinology tab at the matthewsasia.com website, and everybody's welcome to take a look at that. Thank you.
An excellent source, no doubt.
So I saw somebody ask a question. The book I was referring to, I think it was called Spy Schools. I'm less of the view that we need to cooperate with China to be, to solve these claims. I don't believe we need to cooperate with China on climate, on a lot of things. Usually what that implies when they say that is it means give up our own national interest because we need something from China. And I think that would be a huge mistake. I think we're going to move. I don't know who mentioned it, Andy, maybe about, or Lyric about realpolitik and what Nixon and Kissinger were doing. Realpolitik, that's where we're going to have to be with China. We have to abandon this sort of universalist, globalist ideal. That's not going to happen. We have to be focusing first and foremost on U.S. interests when we deal with China. And China is good at milking us for, oh, well, if you cooperate with us on this thing, we'll give you something. I don't think we should be doing those trades anymore. I think we should be much more about, what do we want? And, to Andy's point earlier, we're going to, we have to have a relationship with China. We can't let it deteriorate into a terrible, terrible situation. But, it takes two to tango. Part of that relationship has to be coming back from them. They have to behave more responsibly as well. So, I think that's just the place we're going to be in for 20 years. Hopefully it'll be, going down the middle of the court and not veering off onto one side or the other.
And I just like to underline also, I agree with everybody. I think our panelists are pretty much all of the same mindset. But what I'd say is really look at technical standards. That's where the battlefield will be.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. We've actually exactly within 1 minute, I think, hit the end of our hour. Rob, Andy, Lyric, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your ideas with us. There's obviously a lot of viewpoints and a lot of issues to be addressed. And we've touched on a lot of complex topics. The council itself, as I mentioned, has been in China actively on the ground for more than 12 years. And the general position it's taken, its entry point in this, is that whatever these national level issues, that there's a value at the subnational level and through organizations like ours to keep engaged and keep those discussions going and keep the business going in both directions to the extent that we can help that to continue to happen. We plan to stay constructively engaged, and we want to help our members remain engaged and up to date as the story unfolds, as it will continue to unfold. So we encourage our listeners, our members, to stay in touch with us. We'll stay in touch with you. Rob, Andy, and Lyric, thank you very, very much again. We really appreciate your taking your time with us today. And for all of our listeners, this is being recorded, and we will send you shortly a link that will let you see the program again or share the program if you choose. In the meantime, thank you very, very much again, everybody. We're so glad you could all join us.
Thank you, Sean. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.